Hi, people. So I covered the subject about a month ago, the 16th of March to be precise. Um, so I hope it doesn't sound too repetitive, but I do think it's an important issue, and I think it warrants a lot of thought and consideration, because I think it's not a black and white subject. So I'm just going to read out the report here, and share some of my thoughts because it's an interesting one, and it's I think a difficult moral area. Basically, it's regarding the issue of men in war and the expectations of men in war, particularly looking at Ukraine. So here's the report. It's from the New York Times, and the title is Ukraine's Draft Dodgers Face Guilt, Shame and Reproach. I'll put a link, as always, to the article. The report is by Jeffrey Gentleman and Monica Pronchuk, and this is 11th of April, so it's from yesterday. Chisinau, Moldova, that's Kishinev, also known as Kishinev. Um, Vova Klever, a young, successful fashion photographer from Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, did not see himself in this war. Violence is not my weapon, he said. So shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine in late February and Ukraine prohibited men of military age from leaving the country, Klever sneaked out to London. Klever's mistake, which would bring devastating consequences, was writing to a friend about being smuggled out and making it to London. The friend betrayed his trust and posted the conversation on social media. It went viral, and Ukrainians all over the internet exploded with anger and resentment. You're a walking dead person, one Twitter message said. I'm going to find you in any corner of the world. The notion of people, especially men, leaving war-torn Ukraine for safe and comfortable lives abroad has provoked a moral dilemma among Ukrainians that turns on one of the most elemental decisions humans can make: fight or flee. Thousands of Ukrainian men in military age have left the country to avoid participating in the war, according to records from regional law enforcement officials and interviews with people inside and outside Ukraine. Smuggling rings in Moldova and possibly other European countries have been doing a brisk business. Um, some people have paid up to $15,000 for a secret nighttime ride out of Ukraine, Moldovan officials said. The draft dodgers are the fast exception. That makes it all the more complicated for them, morally, socially, and practically. Ukrainian society has been mobilized for war against a much bigger enemy, and countless Ukrainians without military experience have volunteered for the fight, and some of them have died. To maximize its forces, the Ukrainian government has taken the extreme step of prohibiting men aged 18 to 60 from leaving, with few exceptions. And this is it's my intermission. That was criticised at the time, although Zelensky's been widely praised around the world. There were some particularly masculinist men's rights activists who criticised that as basically a death sentence. And I think it gets into this issue of male expendability, but I'll come back to that. It said it was, they argued it was breaching the human rights of these Ukrainian men to basically force them to stay. All this has forced many Ukrainian men who do not want to serve into taking illegal routes into Hungary, Moldova, and Poland, and other neighbouring countries. Even among those convinced they fled for the right reasons, some said they felt guilty and ashamed. I don't think I could be a good soldier right now in this war, said a Ukrainian computer programmer named Volodymyr who left shortly after the war and did not want to disclose his last name, fearing repercussions for avoiding military service. Look at me, Volodymyr said as he sat in a pub in Warsaw drinking a beer. I wear glasses, I'm 46. I don't look like a classic fighter, some Rambo who can fight Russian troops. He took another sip and stared into his glass. Yes, I'm ashamed, he said. I ran away from this war and it's probably my crime. Ukrainian politicians have threatened to put draft dodgers in prison and confiscate their homes. But within Ukrainian society, even as cities continue to be pummeled by Russian bombs, the sentiments are more divided. A meme recently popped up with the refrain, do what you can where you are. It's clearly meant to counter negative feelings towards those who left and assure them they can still contribute to the war effort. And Ukrainian women and children, the vast majority of the refugees, face little backlash. But that is not the case for young men, and this is what blew up on the young photographer. In mid-March, Olga Lipina, who's worked as a model agent, said Claver sent her husband a message saying he had made it to London. My husband wrote back, Whoa, how? Through Hungary with the smugglers for $5,000, Clever replied according to screenshots of the conversation provided by Lapina. But that's just between us, shush. Lapina said she and Cleaver had been friends for years. She even went to his wedding. But as the war drew near, she said Cleaver became intensely patriotic and a bit of an online bully. When she found out he had avoided service, she was so outraged that he posted screenshots of the conversation on Instagram. So this situation appears to be, assuming she's telling the truth, that the guy's a hypocrite because he was very vocal about the issue. Um, for me, it was hypocrisy to leave the country and pay money for this, she explained, adding he needs to be responsible for his words. That would certainly put a different angle on it if she's telling the truth. Bever, who is in his 20s, was bombarded with death threats. Some Ukrainians resented that he used his wealth to get out and called it cheating. There was one incident actually of a Ukrainian woman. It got a little bit of controversy. She was a politician's wife who apparently used her wealth to get privileges in a refugee queue somewhere. She had jewels and cases. I think this sort of thing's going to happen in war, but I'll finish the report. Responding to email questions, Clifford did not deny skipping out on his service and said he had poor eyesight and had been through a lot lately. Um, you can't even imagine the hatred, he said. Claver gave conflicting accounts of how exactly he exited the country and declined to provide details. But for many other Ukrainian men, Moldova has become the favourite trapdoor. Moldova shares nearly a 800-mile border with Western Ukraine, and unlike Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, Moldova is not part of the European Union, which means it has significantly fewer resources to control its frontiers. It is one of Europe's poorest countries and has been a hub of human trafficking and organised crime. Within days of the war erupting, Moldovan officials said Moldovan gangs posted advertisements on Telegram, a popular messaging service in Eastern Europe, offering to arrange cars, even minibuses, to spear out draft dodgers. Law enforcement officials said the typical method was for the smugglers and Ukrainians to send a rendezvous point along Moldova's green border, the term used for the unfenced border areas, and meet late at night. Um, that's more about the smuggling side of things, so I want to focus on the okay, Moldovan officials said that since late February they had broken up more than 20 smuggling rings, including a few well-known criminal enterprises. In turn, they have apprehended 1,091 people crossing the border illegally. Officials said they were all Ukrainian men. Once caught, these men have a choice. If they do not want to be sent back, they can apply for asylum in Moldova and cannot be deported. But if they do not apply for asylum, they could be turned over to Ukrainian authorities who Moldovan officials said had been pressuring them to send the men back. The vast majority of those who entered illegally, around 1,000, have sought asylum and fewer than 100 have been returned, Moldovan officials said. Um, I'm trying to focus more on the moral side of this. Volodymyr Danilev is one of them. He refuses to fight in the war, although it is not the prospect of dying that worries him. He said it is the killing. That's an interesting side that's often overlooked because as a combatant, you might be obliged to kill. I can't shoot Russian people, said Danilev, 50. Explained that his siblings had married Russians and that two of his nephews were serving in the Russian army in Ukraine. How can I fight in this war? He asked. I might kill my own family. I imagine there will be situations like that around Donetsk. Um, and I'll just close up this because a lot of it is about when the peanut shame flavor, she was no longer in Ukraine herself. She had left too for France with her husband, who is not a Ukrainian citizen. Every day she said she wrestles with guilt. People are suffering in Ukraine, and I want to be there to help them, to support them, she said. But at the same time, I'm safe and I want to be here. It's a very ambiguous, complicated feeling, she said, and she knows she will be judged. Of course, there will be some people who divide Ukrainian nationals between those who left and those who stayed, she said. I'm ready for that. So that's ironic, this woman was herself judging. But as she says, if a guy was very vocal about his patriotism and very aggressive, and as she says, an online bully, and then he didn't kind of put his actions where his mouth is, maybe she has a point. It's interesting. She said she too felt guilty. Women may well feel that, but there's simply not the same level of expectations on women, not just regarding Ukraine in any war, as there are on men. There just isn't. And it's one of my main contentions with feminism, this false narrative of male privilege. I mentioned this in the previous video. I quoted Jemima Lewis's very good article on the subject. Feminists in the West have long spoken about male privilege, about the overbearing patriarchy. They negate to mention that at times of war, the expectation to fight and possibly die is uniquely leveled at men. Now, to be clear, in Ukraine, there have been brave women who have stayed and actually, in some cases, fought. I remember a young woman who died getting supplies to an animal shelter. She died in a Russian shelling, and a lot of civilians have died in this war in Ukrainian atrocities. I think men who are deemed to be survivors are going to be shamed either way, but particularly when so many women and children have been killed. Um, and it's a difficult moral issue. I mean, looking at myself, if the United Kingdom was invaded by a more powerful enemy, I find it very hard to comprehend that I would leave. This is not to say I'm braggadocious, that I'm bravado. Of course, I'd be scared, but I think, I don't know, I just don't think I could. I love my country, and I think that the idea of leaving when it is attacked by a powerful enemy is it's just hard to comprehend. And there is an argument that can be made that these guys are being selfish because right now Ukraine is fighting for its very survival. This is not like a war that Ukraine is involved in another country, such as the American war in Vietnam, where draft dodgers went to Canada and they later, they were arguably on the right side of history because public opinion turned against the war. This is a very different war in the sense that it's a war for the nation's survival. Now, are these guys being selfish by thinking about their own safety first? Although some of them say it's not about the danger that they face, but rather the moral issue of killing others. And that it's a very, very weighted thing. I mean, it's one thing saying, these Russians are killing our women and children, they're the enemy. Quite another to have a young Russian soldier in your sights and to make that step of pulling the trigger. I think that's something that only those who've been in that position can know about, only soldiers and only people who have also, in some cases, civilians who've fought. Also, it's worth pointing out that there have been thousands of foreign volunteers have joined the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. A lot of them come from military backgrounds, but some of them are civilians. There was a guy from Leicester in the UK, he was a plumber. Um, so, some Ukrainians might say, look, these foreign men are fighting. They're dying for our country. What about you guys? Um, and I think the other issue is the fact that many, many Ukrainian men have stayed, not just because it's a law, but because they feel they have to and they want to, and they're very patriotic. Um, Famous boxers, the Klitschko brothers, Alexander Usyk, Lomachenko, those guys who stayed. Um, they're the kind of the personification of courage. Not only are they in a dangerous, tough sport, they're now risking their lives to defend their country. So I think that makes the stigma on these guys even more of a thing. When the migrant issue was going on, still is, in the Mediterranean, there was a very big focus in a lot of the debate in this country about fighting age men coming to the UK. So the argument was, why are these Arab guys and North African guys, why are so many of them men? Why are so many of them young men? Where's the women and children? It's a valid question. It is a valid question. But again, not all wars are the same. Now, in the case of Syria, I have made the point, and I know this is not necessarily a popular opinion, but if you're a Syrian man, what was the choice? The choice was fight for Assad and his brutal forces, or fight for ISIS and their brutal forces. That's a horrendous choice. So, a Syrian doctor or solicitor or teacher, just a normal guy, what sort of choice is that? It's like choosing one evil over another. In other parts of the world, you have situations like, I will point to Eritrea. In that country, there is forced conscription, and not just for 1 year, for years and years. Young men are forced into the forces, and it's a country that's very poor. It's one of the world's worst dictatorships. Now, people saying, what about fighting age men? I would say that, there is legitimate questions around that. Why is there far more men than women? Um, all I would say is context does matter. And, if an Eritrean guy wants to get away from that situation, frankly, I don't blame him. Because it's not like the UK or the US where, you join the armed forces as a matter of patriotism or as a profession, and we don't have conscription. Forced conscription is different from a professional army. Now, in the case of Ukraine, I think it's a different situation. I think that's understandable because, the country needs as much manpower as it can possibly have. So I don't blame Zelensky for making that law. I understand why he did so, because it's fighting for its survival. There's always situations of guilt in war, and the issue about fighting and dying is uniquely leveled on men. That's not to say that women are totally free from shame, though. Of course, there's a well known example after World War II. Many women in France, and this was more focused on women, who were deemed to be collaborators, where they had their heads shaved and they were publicly shamed. It was pretty brutal because, the French people had suffered greatly, and these women were seen as basically, to put it bluntly, um, loose women who were sleeping with the enemy. There's a scene in the film Milena, the Italian film with Monica Bellucci. It's a good movie, where she is basically stripped in the public square and beaten savagely by other women, because she had slept with some German officers. Now, it's uncomfortable viewing, but it's what happened after the war. Um, in this war, the shame is leveled at men, and it's because of the nature of the war. It's a defensive war. Maybe these guys are selfish. I don't know. I just don't know. But I am reluctant to judge them and to condemn them. I'm not going to tell the Ukrainians what to think. If you are a Ukrainian man and you're on the front lines, and maybe your family has been killed, and you know of a guy who has went to safety, it's I imagine you're not going to hold that guy in very high regard. But the final point I would make, though, is on Western feminists. Situations like this shatter the myth of male privilege, because women don't have to make this choice about fighting and dying. Some women do, but that is still their choice. I salute them. I think they're incredibly brave. Situations, like, for example, the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, the women who fought for them, their courage is well established. And why wouldn't they? I mean, they have a vested interest in fighting against Islamists who basically enslave them. And, an argument can be made that women have just as much a right to fight. We're talking about obligations, but they have just as much a right to fight for the country. Um, Indeed, would be the feminist counter that historically women haven't been allowed to join the armed forces, and maybe women want to. But I don't even know in the British armed forces today, the SAS still doesn't allow women. The regular army does. Um, and if you look at those videos, the raw footage from Afghanistan, it is 99.9% men on the front line. I know that some women died in those wars, but it was minimal. It really was. The vast majority of British casualties were male. And that's not to disparage women in the armed forces. I'm not doing that for a second. But it's just feminists need to accept that this is something that is uniquely expected of men. Um, I just would like them to acknowledge that. That's all. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. The moral question is it right to run away when your country's being threatened, when women and children are being killed? I'm not sure that it is. And, I don't know how I would feel if Britain was attacked and there was guys, going off to safety. Would I question them? Maybe I would. Maybe I would. So, I just think this is one of those things that people are quick to judge until they're in the situation. Um, Let me know your thoughts. I'll put a link to the article. But I just wish that feminists would acknowledge that the male privilege is a myth, and nothing more glaringly shows that myth in the fact that men are deemed to be more expendable than women when it comes to war. It's just a reality that women and children are deemed to be the people who should be protected, and men are deemed to be the people who should fight and die. That's a reality. And I have enormous sympathy for all Ukrainians right now. And this is not to say that Ukrainian women haven't suffered; they have suffered enormously. But the shame that these guys are facing, I just have mixed feelings about it. Let me know your thoughts. I'd particularly like to hear Ukrainian perspectives if anyone's watching this. How do you feel about it? Are you a Ukrainian man? How do you feel about it? Are you a Ukrainian woman? How do you feel about it? Personally, I believe I would fight for my country, but it's easy to say that when my country's not in this situation. But I believe in my heart and soul that I would.